afternoon, everybody. My name is Jody Sanford, and I am the Dean of the Evans School of Public Policy and Governance. And it's great to have you here in person and people joining us remotely as well for a conversation this afternoon with Heather Boucher. And this is part of the series that I do focused on the racialized nature of public policy. And I started it when I first arrived 2.5 years ago because, as many of us know, public policy is very racialized, and oftentimes we lose sight of that as we're thinking about problems and solutions. And I feel like public universities, one of our important roles is to really stay focused on important issues that often get obscured in the buzz and hubbub of day-to-day life. Other topics that we've looked at is the structure of child welfare, Indigenous knowledge and leadership post-COVID, looking at how decentralized policy systems really exacerbate inequality, and also looking at just climate change and what we know about some of the federal investments in that regard. And those talks have all, until this one, been virtual. So those recordings are available if you're interested. So before we begin, I will also do a practice that is important to the Evans School, which is to acknowledge the land that we're gathering on for this conversation. This land was originally belonged to the Coast Salish people, and we work and study here. Their ancestors have resided here since time immemorial. And we are deeply rooted in that knowledge and that tradition. We also acknowledge that the country was built from land theft and genocide of Indigenous communities and the enslavement and enforcement of labor from Black people. And these acknowledgements, of course, are just one of the things we do to bring ourselves present for important conversations. And it's very much aligned with our own commitments to building just public policies when we gather to talk about policy issues. And so today, I'm grateful that Heather Boucher has joined us as somebody who's been very interested in intergovernmental relations. Heather's coming to us from the national federal level. And my own background is also in social policy and social programs, but I've focused my career very much on the implementation of social policy. And that's meant that I've spent a lot of my time looking at the way policy ideals get realized at local government, local county welfare offices, local nonprofits. But one of the things that obscures, well, it brings a lot into focus, it obscures a lot of the macro forces that are shaping what policy is and what policy solutions could be considered. And in the last, substantially in my career, inequality has grown tremendously in this country. The Gini coefficient, which is the way people like Heather, one of the ways that we think about income inequality, and has grown significantly over the last, since the 1970s. The income of the top 1% also has grown as a share of all income tremendously. And the concentration of wealth has increased as well. And so economists like Heather have been trying to draw our attention to it. And some have the privilege to be able to think about policy solutions in light of those macro changes. So Heather Boucher here is a member of President Biden's Council of Economic Advisors. She's the chief economist that invests in the American cabinet at the White House. And she came to the White House from time as president and CEO of the Washington Center for Equity. She also spent a lot of time at other policy and government analytical firms, including the Economic Policy Institute, the Center for American Progress. She's written a number of books and edited volumes. And one of the reasons why I think she's here is that she grew up in Mukilteo and got her undergraduate degree from Hampshire College and her PhD from the New School of Social Research. And she is going to spend some time with us today talking about how Bidenomics, I can never say it properly. Bidenomics target system inequities. And so the structure of this is really that Heather will share some comments and remarks with us. And then we really envision this as a dialogue and discussion with you, both people in the room and online. And so take out your little notepads and jot down questions because we'll be engaged with you throughout the session. So thank you for coming. Heather?
Thank you, Jody. Thank you for having me. Thank you for that kind introduction. I'm really so happy to be here today. I wanted to give a quick just shout out to my colleague, Alex Yaquez, who's here with me from the National Economic Council at the White House. He does all the implementation. I'm at the Council of Economic Advisors where, we do a lot of research and analysis and thinking about the ideas, but he is the expert on many things. So it's my honor to be able to talk to you for a few minutes about what we're trying to do, about what the president's theory of the case is for his economic agenda. And we think of this as a new theory of equitable growth. What he is trying to do, and the president said this very early on during the campaign, and in his first press conference as president, he talked about how he wanted to change the paradigm, how he wanted to rethink what we were doing in economics. He often talked about how where we were pre-pandemic wasn't good enough. And so we didn't just need to build back from the pandemic, but we needed to build back from it. And we needed to make sure that we were using resources in a new and different way, that we were fostering growth that could be shared, equitable, and sustainable, and that would really deliver for the American people. And so that's the architecture that I want to talk to you about today. And I want to just stress that from the beginning, from the get-go, this set of ideas, inclusion is really core and fundamental to them. And I'll get to that in a number of places and we can kind of dig into that. But I think it's important to sort of start from the full sort of theory of the case to see how making sure that we are delivering for Americans all across the country means that we need to make sure that we're thinking about how we are empowering and educating and deploying workers and they're all across the country, what that means for families and communities. One of the, so that's just via way of just kind of introduction to the theme. Let me sort of dig into it a little bit. So in contrast to, in many ways, 50 years of economic thinking and 50 years of not real, I mean, there's a little bit of econ thinking in there, vis-a-vis like what happens at universities, but also in the public dialogue, the way that we were thinking and talking about the economy. We were often told that if we just gave businesses the wherewithal to invest, if we took away their taxes, if we made it easier for them to invest through deregulation, then they would invest and that would create jobs and those jobs would be good jobs and America's middle class would grow and thrive. And as Jody noted in her introduction, instead, what we've seen is over my lifetime, over the past 50 plus years, all we've seen for the most part is rising economic inequality across all vectors, rising inequality by wages, by income, rising concentrations of wealth, rising concentrations across firms, across our economy. And so that growth that we had didn't trickle down. And as it turns out, that pace of growth that we've seen over the past half century was actually slower than in the decades before, just after World War II, where growth was more equitable and it was faster. So the president really starts from this conception that if we focus on delivering, can we deliver growth that is stronger and faster? But that was just one of the crises that the president confronted when he took office. So one was rising economic inequality. Second, were longstanding racial and ethnic gaps across our economy, across our country. And those were longstanding. So even where they hadn't widened, they hadn't shrunk, or certainly hadn't shrunk enough. Third, of course, is the existential crisis of climate change, which is causing increasing havoc across our economy, across our society, across the land and the natural resources. And we've seen this increased number of weather-related disasters that are costing hundreds of billions of dollars. We're seeing all governments at all levels, state governments, local governments, the federal government having to spend more and more money to address the challenges of climate change. And of course, we need to make this transition to clean energy as a result, but it's an increasing cost. It's creating fragilities. And then fourth, of course, when the president ran for office, we were in the middle of a pandemic. And one thing we all learned is that our supply chains were really, really fragile. Like they weren't working, they weren't delivering the things that we need. We saw pictures of doctors and nurses wearing, garbage bags and, sort of jerry-rigging face masks because we just didn't have enough of what we needed. But that was just emblematic of larger challenges in our supply chains. So the president's goal when he took office was not just to build back from the pandemic, but in his words, to build back better. And in the first couple of years, we talked a lot, my colleagues and I, about how we just couldn't say the word we were going back to normal. Because we weren't, we didn't want to go back to normal. And so it's funny, I barely say that word normal out loud anymore. Because I sort of would try to, excise it from my vocabulary, but we needed to build back better. Where we were wasn't good enough. And so that's where we started. So the president then focused his attention on what we needed to do. And there are really 4 pieces of historic legislation. And this can be said now without a shadow of a doubt, that the last congressional session, the one that ended last year, or just a little less than a year ago, it was one of the most historic, the most productive congressional sessions in generations. Starting with the rescue plan, we got the economy out of the pandemic recession. I want to just pause there just for a second. We now know that the recovery in the United States has not only been the strongest in terms of the pace of job creation and how fast jobs came back across our economy, our society, of any recovery in decades, far faster. But we know that even though we've seen inflation alongside this very robust economic recovery, that has come back down. It has come back down faster than among our economic competitors. All of our economic competitors also saw the same kind of inflation, but they did not see their employment rates come down as fast. They have not seen their inflation rates come down as fast, and they did not see their growth as high as we saw. So I think the history books, when they write the story of what happened over the first few years of the Biden administration, that economic history, this was a profoundly important economic recovery. It showed what we could do if we put our minds to it. So the first thing we did was get the economy back on track. But as I said, that wasn't good enough. We then had to think about the structural challenges in the economy. What was really going wrong? So there were 3 pieces of legislation, and there was a lot of talk during the campaign and the transition on how we would package these. And so there were a lot of ideas, and here's what we ended up with, right? A lot ended up on the cutting room floor, a lot was kind of added, but 3 pieces of legislation. The bipartisan infrastructure law is sending hundreds of billions of dollars of money to communities all across the country to rebuild infrastructure, to get lead out of pipes, to make sure that communities have sewer systems, to make sure that every family has access to affordable high-speed broadband and internet, roads, bridges, all of this. We have been talking about this for decades. And we're finally doing it. We are finally doing that core investing in America, getting our infrastructure up to snuff. So that's thing 1. Thing 2 is a set of investments to make sure that the United States is on the cutting edge of innovation and the important technologies that we need for national security and economic security. And that starts with semiconductors, so the CHIPS and Science Act, that is making these investments and making sure that the United States can produce the cutting edge silicon chips that we need to be able to have access to, and that are also really important for national security, that we have access to that way, that these are being made in a way that we know they aren't getting into the wrong hands. And we saw during the pandemic that the lack of access to chips meant that Americans couldn't buy new cars. They couldn't buy a lot of things because we just didn't have the chips that we needed. That's a supply chain issue. For too long, we thought that supply chains only needed to be efficient. What we learned is that they have to be resilient, and somebody has to pay for that. So a different title of my talk could be, let's talk about the negative externalities and how we're going to internalize them. Seems a little wonky, so I don't usually go there, but then I've got some audience members here that are getting the job. I thought I would go there. But resiliency, it's really important. Anybody will tell you there are actual economic costs of the lack of resiliency. Somebody's going to pay for them. And what we need to make sure is that the right people are paying for them, that those costs are being borne by the parts of your economy and your society that are best well equipped to do so. So that's the second investment legislation. And then, of course, the third is the Inflation Reduction Act. And that act did a lot of things to actually pull down inflation. It's paid for, lowers health costs for families. It finally means that the federal government is negotiating over prescription drug prices through Medicare. It means that insulin is now at $35 a month for folks that are on Medicare, and actually for other folks now too, because the private sector stepped up. So that's a lot of cost cutting, but at the same time, there are these game-changing investments in clean energy. And actually, there's game-changing investments in clean energy in all of these pieces of legislation. CHIPS and Science Act has some, Bipartisan Infrastructure Law has some, and the Inflation Reduction Act does. Now, I want to stress these three laws were designed together and they're being implemented together. And so while they each have their own particular path through Congress, and we can talk about that if we want, but it's over now. And again, not everything made it across the finish line, but so there's still work to be done. And those core pieces that did not make it across the finish line were in the president's budget last year, the care economy agenda that just didn't get passed, the childcare, the universal pre-K, the money for home health aides, the money for paid family leave, that was all in the budget. And we hope to come back and the president's committed to doing that. But for now, these core pieces focusing on what our economy produces are what we're focused on implementing on. And this gets us to the first pillar of Bidenomics. So the first pillar of Bidenomics is that starts from the basic insight that what we make in America and how we make it matters. It matters for the health and well-being of our society, for the resiliency of our economy, for our economic growth. The policymakers can't be agnostic about what the economy is producing. Semiconductors is a perfect example here. The government can't be agnostic about whether the market delivers this cutting edge technology. We have an interest in that. Climate change, it's real. And the only way through it, unless we're all gonna just completely stop, we're all gonna just go back and live in huts without electricity and we're not gonna use fossil fuels. We're not gonna do that, which I've met a lot of humans and I don't think that most humans wanna do that. The path to addressing climate change has to be through creating a clean energy industry. Government has to care about what our economy is producing. And newsflash, the private market hasn't delivered it. Sidebar, private capital spent a lot of time on software and not enough time on hardware, not enough time on that technology that can get at those next generation technologies for clean tech. We can talk about that later too, if we want. And so the first pillar of Bidenomics is about the investments that we need to make. So all of these pieces of legislation are focused on investing in America. So again, my title is the Chief Economist for the Investing in America Cabinet, thinking a lot about what these investments are, what they look like across the economy, across our society. So I've just outlined to you what this legislation does, and we're seeing these investments all across the country. I'll come back to that in a minute at the end of my sort of starting point here. But we know that we need to make these massive game-changing investments, and we're finally doing it. So what we invest in matters: cutting edge technology, clean energy, infrastructure. And through these investments, I want to just spend one little moment here on what it means to be engaging in the market. We are embarking on a new modern American industrial strategy. We are engaging in the market in a different way. It's what the president meant when he said he wanted to change the paradigm. There are a number of ways he meant that. But one of them is this: we need to care about what we make. And so how do we do that? How do we do that in a way that makes the most of markets and all the wonderful things that markets are equipped to do, that acknowledges that we have, as a society, have certain goals we need to meet. We need to meet our Paris commitments. We need to meet our net zero emissions by 2050. How are we going to reconcile the two? So our investments focus attention on both the supply and demand side, from the innovation to commercialization pipeline. So investments on the supply side to invest in goods that have these strong positive externalities. We are investing in new research and development for clean energy, new in the semiconductor investments. So these new investments on the cutting edge of technology, providing grants, we just made this announcement around hydrogen hubs around the country. Those are the kinds of supply side investments that we're seeing, and different, again, the hubs is a great example, but different parts of these investments are at different parts from that innovation through to commercialization pipeline. So I often think about the Loans Program Office, which is helping clean energy and other technologies really make it from demonstration. I've got a good idea, I can pilot it, but how do I actually get it out there in the world? So making sure that we're not leaving any of these investments on the sideline, but at the same time, using all of our demand side policies to make sure that we're also giving consumers a really important role. So we have tax credits for purchasing electric vehicles, tax credits for purchasing new heat pumps for your home. So that there's a combination of both targeted investments where we're taking a chance on technologies, and then a lot of tax credits and subsidies that make that don't care what the technology is. So the investment tax credit, the production tax credit. So really trying to be both government-led, really government enabling this, but then allowing the private sector to really lead on those actual technologies. And all of this with the goal of crowding in private investment for those really important parts of our economy. Okay, so that's the first pillar, what we invest in, investing in America. Second is how we invest. And there's two pillars here. So the first, so the president's agenda is focusing on making investments that empower and educate workers. And I am here with you this morning, it's not morning, afternoon, and it's just been announced this morning. The UAW now has a tentative agreement with GM. So the three companies that they were striking against, they now have tentative agreements with all three. And President Biden was the first president in anyone's recollection. It was kind of funny when this happened because none of the newspapers wanted to say he was the first one ever. But as far as anybody knows, the first president to join a picket line, and certainly in any recorded memory. And this is really important to the president. Because what he's saying to that is that he understands that unions have a really important part to play in empowering workers across our economy. There's a lot of research and evidence on the role that unions play in our economy and productivity, but they're also about making sure that workers get a fair day's pay. And at the same time, what you saw in this particular strike, and I think it's a really interesting case study, is that those unions were focused on how their legacy firms, which are now competing with the upstart firms in making electric vehicles, what these firms need to do to succeed. So if you dig into what the union did, it wasn't about destroying the competitiveness of these industries. It's about making sure that these three businesses could be successful while also making sure that workers could benefit from it. Again, I think it's a really interesting case study, something to dig into, but that's my read of the situation. We could have a debate about that. The second pillar, empower and educate workers. The president's been very focused on noting that he wants to create good jobs all across the economy, that he's pro-union, and really making sure that we're bringing everybody along. And this is where inclusion plays just such a really important part. At the federal level, this president is so focused on making sure that we have that we are doing what we can at the federal level to support local economic development strategies all across the country, that they are inclusive, that we are bringing communities along and doing everything that we could with the dollars that we got to make sure that we are educating workers and training them for the jobs of the future. I say with the dollars that we got because a lot of those workforce development dollars ended up on the cutting room floor as the legislation went through Congress, and that was truly heartbreaking. But my colleague and I, just came this morning, we were talking to a clean tech accelerator, them talking about what they are doing around workforce development and training and how they're leveraging local dollars, local state dollars, but also business investment to make sure that they are getting that workforce development piece right. And it was actually exciting to hear, given how, what a challenge that is. So a lot of focus and energy on that, and really a lot of focus on making sure that the president has made this commitment, the Justice 40 commitment, to make sure that 40% of investments go to communities that need it most. A lot of focus and attention on fossil fuel communities to make sure that they are being brought along. And again, a lot of attention on auto workers, knowing that this industry is going to change. They're not going to be making internal combustion engines anymore. They're going to be making electric vehicles. How do we bring an industry that's so important to so many places across the country, so many workers, so many families? How do we make sure that that transition to new production methods works for them? A lot of attention and focus on that. And then the third pillar on how we are investing is that we're shaping markets to be fair and competitive. And I gotta say, as an economist, I love this one. And I'm also super excited that it's an actual pillar. Because for most of my career, Washington, D.C. has not been enforcing our antitrust laws in the ways that we needed to. So I said at the beginning, there were a number of crises, and I talked about inequality, and I brought up, if you're an inequality scholar, you're really used to thinking about Gini coefficients and income and wage wealth. But I also noted concentration across firms. And all of this is interconnected, right? The rising concentration across wealth is connected to the rising concentration across firms. But that saps an economy of its vitality. It makes it harder for small businesses to thrive. I think it's actually deeply connected to the fact that we focus more on finance for tech companies that will use software rather than investing in real things. I think these are connected issues. We can talk about that, but really making sure. And the president had a whole executive order to do a whole of government effort around market structure and competition, making sure that he was pushing every agency, not just the FTC and the Department of Justice, but every agency to think about whether or not their actions were making markets more fair, more competitive, and not just good for the monopolists. Along with making game-changing appointments to leadership positions at the Department of Justice and the FTC, say we're going to do things differently. We now have this big case against Amazon that really is about making sure that small businesses can thrive on this platform that is so important for the businesses. But if the rules aren't fair, then you're cutting off that vitality and that innovation, which is what makes American capitalism so incredible. So, and then part and parcel to shaping markets is also this focus on resiliency. So we've seen over the past couple of years, supply chains have been getting back to systems that are far more resilient. It's been an enormously important priority for the administration. We had all of these supply chain reports that were done early on. How can we make them more resilient? It's about making sure that we are shaping these markets to work for Americans, to work for American businesses, and to work for us when we need it. So that's the theory of the case. And let me just spend, I don't have my whole slide deck here, but I'll just spend a few moments talking about the success. Because I'm very proud of what this president has accomplished, very proud to be a part of this team, especially when I look at what we've done. So I talked a little bit about the recovery in generations, created almost 14 million jobs, an unemployment rate for Black Americans that hit historic lows going back to 1978. It's bounced around a bit since then, but it did stay there for quite some time. An unemployment rate that's been below 4% for 20 months now. That has not happened in over 50 years. This is really a remarkable economy. Growth, whatever it was, 4 point whatever, sorry, too many numbers in my head. 4.9% in the third advanced estimate for the third quarter, and inflation that still has to get lower, but it is far lower than it was, and it's come back down. So that's thing one. Thing two is that this legislative agenda is leading to all of this infrastructure investment all across the country, and is led to over $600 billion of crowded in private investment. Investments in battery manufacturing, investments in power plants, investments in semiconductors, investments all across the country. And my friends over at the Treasury Department did a nice little work for the 1-year anniversary where they looked at where those private investments are going. So here's the thing, when you're doing paradigm change, I gotta say as an economist, the most annoying thing is that our data and analytic systems aren't set up to monitor things in the way that I would like them to. So because we're doing tax subsidies, we want capitalism to do its thing. We want to direct it, but we're not directing it. I don't have data on where the tax credits are going. Don't ask me where those are going yet. We only know who's using them, right? And we only know these announced investments. So I'm really limited in the data and analytic tools I have. But what we know from private announcements is over 600 billion in privately announced investments all across the country. My colleagues over at Treasury looked at those privately announced investments. Okay, you could ask me, well, maybe some of those won't happen. Okay, well, this is the best data we got. They said, where is that investment going? Well, it's actually going disproportionately to communities that need it most. Disproportionately going to communities with that are populated by people who have less education. So it's not disproportionately going to the richest communities with the most PhDs or the most college graduates. It's going to communities that tend to be a little bit lower income, that tend to have more folks with high school or community college degrees. And so when you look at these maps across the country about where these investments are going, they're going all across America, and they're creating opportunity in places that didn't used to have it. And that is exactly what the president wanted. We're not leaving any communities behind, and making sure that we acknowledge one nation, one economy, and that these investments are happening all over the place. And that is, I think, a testament to the way that these investments have been crafted. I often think of the clean energy subsidies as a layer cake. You get a little bit more in your production or your investment tax credit depending on what you do. And one of them is you get a bonus if you make your investment in an energy community, fossil fuel energy community. Or you get a little bonus if you make it in a low income community. You get a little bonus if you use domestic content. And all of those, I think we're starting to see pay off in where companies are investing. That they're saying, hey, if I go over here, there's a lot of workers, there's a lot of opportunity, but I can also get a little bit more capital to help me do that. And that was the point of those investments. And hopefully the data, once we get it in the years to come, will bear this all out. So I just wanted, I will stop there and then let Jody ask questions. But thank you for your attention. Thanks for the help on the numbers there. And yeah, thank you to those of you online.
When Heather arrived, she said that she has slides, and so it is our practice to share resources back out with you after this talk, so for detailed slides. But we thought that actually having a little bit more of an intimate conversation here would work. So I'm going to kick off first question, but would invite you to think about your question. And so I really appreciate you laying out the pillars. And I wanted to go to the first one about what we make matters. You referenced that we haven't made enough hardware. And that there's been kind of a bias to not thinking about that kind of infrastructure more broadly in these markets. And so I'd like to learn a little bit more about what you've done on the supply side, because I think part of what's challenging to hear as you're laying out this, I believe you when you say that this is a generational shift in how we think about government's investment and interactions with the markets. But because it's a generational shift, I only know about the past from long ago history. Like it isn't part of our lives. Right? We came up during and life was shaped by Reaganomics, right? And so this way of thinking about alterations in the supply side is really intriguing to me. Some more examples there would be helpful.
Yeah, happy to. So so it's a great question and it's a tough one, right? There's in economics and related like economic development and the fields that kind of touch that, there's long been this sense that industrial policy doesn't work. And we actually talk about it as industrial strategy. My colleague Brian Deese, when he was the director of the National Economic Council, used that term, and I found it very compelling because what it acknowledges is that it's not a policy. You don't have industry, you don't have a policy for industry. You have a set of policies. And in fact, it's a very, very long list. And we've always done it. There's all these policies that interact with industry. So when you say industrial policy, what do you mean, right? But when you think about it as a strategy, well, what are we trying to achieve? What does government actually care about? Do we care whether or not the United States makes these chairs? Do we care that they make they're not chalkboards, whatever the dry erase boards? But what do we care about? What is actually important? What kinds of industries? And what does it mean to think about an industry versus an individual firm? And that's a really important piece as well. So we start from the sort of the perspective of what's important. And that's always going to be an iterative conversation, right? You're always going to be evaluating what's important. Certainly from day one, semiconductors, it was clear that this was, and that had been brewing for years. People were realizing that we didn't have the capacity to make the most technologically sophisticated semiconductors. And that's a national security risk. The national security people are like, excuse me, this is not going to end well for us. We need to fix this. But semiconductors are a very complicated technology. There's a semiconductor facility. They call them fabs because I guess they're fabulous. I don't know. They call them fabs. But there's one near DC that I want to go and visit. But my understanding is that there are these very, very large facilities making these things that you can't even see, which I find kind of, it seems very confusing. But they are, the fact that they are so important and that they have these huge capital investments and that the businesses that are investing in this need to make continual huge capital upgrades. It's a specific kind of business model, and Taiwan their government has made serious investments. If we want to do that, our government was going to have to do that. That was the way this is going to work. And so, and that's something that was bipartisan. for folks on both sides of the aisle understood this is about competition with China. It's about our place in the global economy. And so there are the work that the Department of Commerce is doing, is supporting, their grant applications, supporting specific firms. That process is ongoing. That's supply side. Let me focus on the clean energy because the strategy is we got to get to net zero. And the president has all these different goals for different years. There's a lot of them. I have a little list on my wall at my office. But we want to get to 100% clean power by 2030. We want half of all cars sold by 2030 to be electric vehicles. We want to get to net zero by 2050, net zero emissions. And one background point here is that the folks that monitor what we need to do to get emissions down tell us, so if we think that it was scored at 370 billion, the Inflation Reduction Act was scored at 370 billion for the clean energy pieces. It's probably going to be a lot more than that. Different conversation. But the IEA says that we need at least 4 trillion on an annual basis globally to meet our clean energy goals. So what we did, the biggest thing the United States has ever done, is a little drop in the bucket. And most of that money needs to come from the private sector, not the public sector. And so we need all of this money globally. There's all this opportunity, and where can the US invest? So I will send this out in a little slide deck. I've got this lovely slide from our friends over at the Department of Energy, where they kind of show, okay, we've got the Office of Science, we've got ARPA-E, we've got the Small Business Innovation Research Funds. All of this is on the R&D side. And I don't know if any of you are working on the clean energy stuff here at the UW, but I know you guys are probably over here on the more sort of research end, right? Before you get to just demonstration deployment. Then we've got things like the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations that are, about getting, sort of that valley of death there. Like, how do you get through the demonstration? And then the loans program office that is saying, okay, you're almost there. What do you need? And that office is really also about saying, de-risking those investments. So that so LPO is coming in and they do this whole process. It takes a lot of time. But then that government agency kind of gives its seal of approval to a new technology. And then private capital knows it's been vetted. It's probably going to work out. Maybe it won't. Tesla did. So, you can start there, right? That was originally their funding for the cars was an LPO loan. So they've all these different offices and tools that are focused on the supply side. But in both of these cases, we chose the industries and then trying to figure out where markets can work their magic and where you need to push on the margins. And so it is, I think of it as, you're setting the lanes, got to do clean energy. Okay, where are the, some of the places that you're hearing that you need to intervene, but where can you make sure that you're letting the market do the most of the work? And then I would direct us back, the IRS has become the biggest, most important agency for clean energy, right? Because they're administering all the tax credits and, that process is ongoing. This is a huge new endeavor for them. That's about letting markets work their magic. If you want to get an investment tax credit or a production tax credit to produce clean energy, government doesn't care what your firm is, what you're investing in. You get the tax credit, right? We're not picking your technologies. We're not, quote unquote, and I hate the phrase picking winners and losers. We're not doing that there, right? But yet we're also using the Department of Energy's expertise to build, and the labs across the country to build out some technologies. So it's really trying to make the most of a variety of different things. All of it is about inducing private capital. I will end with this. We have seen a massive increase in the investment in the construction of manufacturing facilities, particularly in electronics around the country. We don't have enough data to really get too deep into that yet, but it is, we've seen a bigger share of this, that investment as a share of GDP is bigger than it has been in 50 years. And so that is a testament to the crowding in of private capital that we're already seeing. So I don't know if that gets at all your question, but.
It does, and it raises many more questions for me.
I know.
But let's turn it to the audience. Bill, do you want to?
Yeah. Could you elaborate some more on the workforce training part of this? That's clearly part of the strategic approach to this. You hinted at, or summarized very couple of steps that have been taken or tried, and also maybe where the politics stands right now.
Yeah, so there are, a number of things we're doing on the workforce, development side. Let me just name a couple. I mean, so here's the thing. I want to start by grounding the workforce conversation in the following. I'm first and foremost, a labor economist, so I have a lot of views on this. One of the things I've heard a lot is that you've got a lot of businesses making new investments in new technologies and new fields, and they're worried about enough workers. And that's a testament to, honestly, decades of failure of making investments in the public institutions that can make for sure that people are ready for new jobs. And one of the things, I've been at a number of events with business leaders over the past couple of weeks, and one of the things that kind of is that I've heard bubbling up is, well, people don't know about these jobs. And I'm kind of like, well, whose problem is that? I mean, seriously, whose problem is that? I'm very excited to be today at an institution of higher learning, right? So it's your problem here at the UW, right? You have to make sure that students know where the jobs of the future are going to be. So you all, professors and faculty and career counselors are out there hopefully trying to understand where those changes are so that you can make sure that you're telling those students, here's what the next 20 years is going to look like. Here's what we can train you for. But that's got to happen at community colleges, and it's got to happen at high schools and junior highs. Are those kids and their parents, do they see what's happening? And what I see happening is that you've got a lot of startups that are like, here's the problem with workforce. Super exciting. Us and the rest of the world, we're all moving towards clean energy, but we're all doing it on the same day. And so everybody's, and it's all new. So everybody's like, I don't know, what do we need, right? So some of the challenge, and I say this because my friends over at the Department of Labor, they don't know what we need to train workers for where. They can't answer that question because we're doing an industrial strategy. We're letting markets work their magic. That means that businesses are the ones that are doing the investment. I look at these maps of announced business investment, and I'm like, okay, well, here's where you need to start, but it has to be a local conversation. So yes, you've got to connect the dots.
Because those conversations have been very disjointed broadly, most of the country.
Exactly. So one of the exciting things we're doing, so in 5 places in America, Phoenix, Columbus, Baltimore, Augusta, Georgia, and Pittsburgh, we've set up the federal government set up these workforce hubs. It's coming directly from the chief of staff's office. So it's an executive office of the president-led hubs that are saying, hey, let's look at what's happening on the ground. We know that that in this community, there's a really great, in each of them, there's a really great economic development community that's connected with some training and apprenticeship programs. It's connected with these. What can we learn? What are we doing? How do we create that synergy, that communication? And then how do we take that and multiply it across the country? But this is a challenge to every community in the country to build that and to tell us at the federal level what you need to be able to make that work, because we can't solve this problem for you, right? This has got to be something that is about that partnership. And I do worry that we haven't invested enough over time in community colleges, in high schools, in the technical training. I'm here visiting, spending up, my niece and nephew are just like at these ages, they're 16 and 19, and talking, they actually happened to be in DC the day that the IRA passed. So it was very exciting to share that with them in Washington. They got to actually do their White House tour like the day after. But to hear them now and how they are seeing those opportunities and just that's not kind of billowing through their world. So I think that is the challenge.
So I want to dovetail on that.
I've got questions for you, is basically was my answer.
Oh, good. Okay. So hopefully I can give some answer to that. So I'm one of those folks on the front lines working in workforce. So with Seattle Jobs Initiative, one of the structural things, and this has a race equity component to it, is that a lot of the federal programs don't allow you to explore new careers. If you are low income, you have to choose a career pathway and go through that training program. And if you fail or you change or it's not for you, you lose all your benefits. So that's an example, I think, of a structural or systemic change that can happen, that career exploration or learning about these things is oftentimes a point of privilege. And if we're going to get the workforce to be able to do that, we have to be able to make that much more active.
That is a great point. Is that a point that's commonly known
It's interesting because we were actually doing our looking at our strategic plan, what we're doing for this year, and during that conversation with our board and leadership, that really came up as something that we're hoping to amplify as part of our race equity strategy. So
That is so, you need to amplify, I will amplify that, but that is so important. That is so important. I'm visiting a lot of incubators, clean energy
Yeah.
incubators, and seeing, you know, meeting folks that are coming in. But it's an exploration, and also these are new. We're developing new industries, right? There's a lot of questions, and we as people, we're not good with holding questions, right? Especially when kids got to make a decision about what to invest in.
So another strategic, critical linchpin in this is the high school counselor or high school information. Disconnect between the education system and the labor, workforce. I think we're a little better in the state as of last week, but it's a really huge gap there.
And how you make that connection, how we can be helpful. I mean, that's open to ideas, but these 5 hubs are trying to do that. And then we've got, just to note a couple of the things that we're doing. We have a good jobs initiative from the Department of Labor that is sort of trying to, help folks understand, businesses understand, and agencies understand what a good job is. You've got an advanced manufacturing workforce sprint that's trying to understand what these new advanced manufacturing techniques are going to be to try to create that connective tissue. And we have seen clean energy jobs increasing, and actually women have been getting a disproportionate share of those jobs, which I think is an interesting fact to throw out there. But you do have to make this connection. And then I do think it's really important to communicate with parents about where there is opportunity. The last point I'll add on this, which is less about training, but about apprenticeships, or it's about the trades. Given what we know about what we're going to need, at least for the next decade, we're going to need a lot of construction workers, right? We need a lot of people to build the clean energy future. We're also going to need a lot of people ways to cope with climate change. Like a lot of the coping is essentially construction, reconstruction, tearing down, rebuilding, coping with natural disasters. And I don't think that the educational institutions, especially high schools and community colleges, have thought about the really important role of the trades in a clean energy economy. A clean energy economy is not a pull oil out of the ground economy. It is a manufactured economy. It's going to require a lot of investments in resiliency. And that requires that we rethink what we want kids to do. So we've spent 20, 30 years really thinking about STEM, still super, super, super important. But what does that mean when we're thinking about adaptation and mitigation in a different way? So just calls to action. There was hands up.
Question in the back.
Yeah, I actually wanted to chime in about the career exploration element. I'm a material science student, did it for my undergrad, going on to do it in my master's. We sort of refer to it as golden handcuffs sometimes. So I wanted to absolutely validate and also say, once you have sort of like an elementary training, in chemical engineering, material science, that is enough to sort of allow you to choose for yourself, like between battery research, photovoltaics, the underlying like construction and processing often is very interchangeable between the two. The chemistry can be very similar. Even, things like battery technology and corrosion are the same sort of category of reactions. So I'm not too clear on how the restrictions work in a lot of cases, but the training you get to be able to enter the field gives you a good enough understanding to be able to go in multiple places. That's sort of by design. So I just wanted to validate that.
I think this comments on training really, as somebody who cares a lot about implementation, it's a little bit where the challenge is. You've done a massive reorientation to an economic set of strategies.
Yeah.
And the implementation systems were built around a lot of the assumptions of the previous paradigm.
Yeah.
Right. And so there was for many, many years a focus on very specific training and a very specific thing, and you're getting on that path and you don't leave. So it will be up to all of us to try and reorient the way we do our work in line of a pretty different shift in paradigm. And that's a big deal.
Well, and I think I think that your use of the word paradigm there, I find it's so interesting, because I've realized that when the president started saying paradigm change, I was really excited when he said that on the campaign. And then I've realized in a very deep way, it's not one paradigm. It's like a gazillion of them, right? It's all, as you're just pointing out, these, like, when you're shifting a whole bunch of different things at once, which is requiring a lot of different communities of practice to say, oh, we need to do something different. But then there's first mover, like, oh, you can't change what the community college or high school is doing until you have a better sense of who's investing in your community. You got to organize the business, and these businesses, maybe they're startups, or maybe they're shifting their technology. They don't have their, so there's a lot, it's a time of enormous questions. And that's exciting. And there's a lot of opportunity, but we have to move fast. And so this is, we have to move fast on the clean energy stuff for the sake of the planet. And that is a very stressful, challenging place to be.
I have an online question that sort of speaks to some of this larger shifting. It seems that despite positive developments, workers are still facing a lot of economic headwinds. The Federal Reserve recently published a note showing how the white minority wealth disparity is continuing to grow. The number of people reporting living paycheck to paycheck, if you're spending more than half of their income on housing, is up, and so on. When can we expect to see some stabilization and reversal in these trends, knowing that this equity is a focus for Bidenomics? When are we going to start to see that?
Yeah,
That's a $1 million question.
It's a really $1 million question. So change is hard. It's not easy. I think, I would start with a couple of points. I mean, first, the vast majority of us get the vast majority of our income from holding down a job. So the core foundation of economic security in this country, as we know it, important caveats there, as we exist today, is whether or not people have jobs, and then whether or not those are or can be good jobs. So that's why I always come down to what is the unemployment rate? The share of prime age, what they call prime age women, I'm starting to get a little resentful of that term, from 25 to 54, who are in the labor force is been at highs not seen since we started tabulating that data in 1948. The share of people in the labor force overall is back to 20-year highs. We had seen this downward trend in labor force participation. So those are good. So in terms of the change you need to make, that's thing one. People need to be in the labor force. They need to be at those jobs, getting towards that high employment metric. That's really the first criteria. Then those have to be good jobs. And so I think that's why the president's support of unions, the enormous achievements that we've seen in terms of seeing wages be able to keep pace with inflation in recent months, the fact that wages at the bottom have been growing faster than those at the top for much of the recovery. These are important accomplishments. We know that prices have been too high, and we know that there are core things that are too expensive. College, housing, childcare, childcare. These things are too expensive, and those are big ticket items where you kind of can't scrimp on them, right? You can't kind of buy half of a house or half a college degree, although you can, and then you're stuck with a loan you can't repay, right? Or half of a childcare. So the president is focused on making those more affordable, and will continue to focus on those. But then I think that it is about doing everything we can to make sure that those are good jobs. And I think that you'll start to see that pay off over time, but it's a process. It's not gonna, it doesn't turn on a dime. We didn't get here quickly, but we are definitely, the signs point that we are moving in the right direction, and that is what we need to focus on.
Slightly different note. I have a question about the nature of debt. And so it's hard to get ahead when if you're starting so far behind. So I know we have student loan debt reform, but I was wondering what the administration's thought about debt more systemically, such as medical debt or the practice credit card companies, which put particular people of color further in debt. And so it creates a negative cycle. You might get a job, but you still are just making up losses without being investing in other things.
Yeah, I mean, this has been an important issue, and it's one that, as interest rates go up, is of course more harder on families, or it can be. And of course, you're seeing right now, because of the rise in interest rates, people sort of trapped in their homes. You're not seeing that movement that you might normally see. Student debt has been a major area where the president has tried to do reforms, and obviously the Supreme Court has made that less possible. Having said that, there have been a series of steps taken to make that debt more affordable, give as much debt as the Department of Education can. I am not up on what we're doing on medical debt. I don't know if you are up on what we're doing on that.
Yeah, so.
Thank you. I was hoping, I was like trying to catch your eye there.
So we, at the NEC, at the Domestic Policy Council, and in particular with the, Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, have been really attuned to how medical debt, operates in our healthcare system, and in particular, whether medical debt is an actual indicator of somebody's creditworthiness or willing or, ability to actually repay debt in a reasonable way, which is how it gets reflected on your credit score. And so the CFPB took action to investigate medical debt, to basically put on notice that be watching for fraudulent and deceptive activities. And a number of the main three credit score providers have actually now agreed, thanks to work done by the administration, to end the collection, basically, of sending your a medical debt and set to collection to your credit scores. So continue to needs to work to ensure that that folks do not become indebted due to medical emergencies. First and foremost, the number one way to do that, as proven in the literature, is to insure people. We found after Medicaid expansion under the Affordable Care Act in the adult working age population that coverage just instantly and dramatically decreased medical debt. It's the number one driver. Uninsurance, the number one driver of having medical debt. So the states who have not yet implemented that, free money on the table to ensure their population, that's going to be the main way to drive forward. But also working with HHS and others. We administer a lot of care. The Veterans Administration has done some work to ensure that its veterans that it services are not, and active duty service members in the military branches are not being held to account for medical debt incurred under the government's dime, and we are providing services. So continue to build out where we have equities in the healthcare system, which happens to be in quite a bit of it.
Thank you, Alex. See, Alex knows the answer.
We're almost out of time, but did you want to ask one more from remote?
Sure, it was a building on the healthcare question. If we want to stay on healthcare, okay. This is from an online participant. Monopolies pose a risk to consumers and patients, and getting a new market entrant in concentrated markets in small towns is not necessarily efficient, nor is it likely. How does the administration feel about non-antitrust solutions like a new public hospital or new uses of the public utility model in the healthcare space?
Sorry, I didn't get the middle part of it.
I think it's sort of like, it's particularly getting into smaller markets, smaller towns, getting healthcare. How does the administration feel about using sort of this public utility model, but in the healthcare space is the question.
It's a really interesting question. I don't have a good answer for that off the top of my head. But I think that, we have seen a lot of work showing that the monopolization that has happened in private in hospitals has not been good for patients. It's not been good for workers, either nurses or doctors or other healthcare professionals. And, it is one of the things that the administration has acknowledged, just how challenging that is. So that concentration is certainly something that we've been looking at, but that specific question, I don't have a good answer to, but I can follow up.
So my final question feels to me to be the elephant in the room, which is, I think your analysis is compelling and there's lots of information, right, that we are really able to understand empirically problems, solutions, to develop policies that make sense. And yet there's a large proportion of this country that isn't interested somehow in evidence-informed policymaking.
Yep.
And I guess you're in a very unique role because you come out of a very esteemed career in evidence-informed policy recommendations and making. And so I'm curious about what insights you might offer to those of us who are committed to that, and how we might cut through some of the noise that seems to be occupying so much of the attention of the press.
Yeah, I will say a few things. So first, when you look at the polls, people are overwhelmingly in favor of the actual things that the president has done. The things like childcare that didn't get across the finish line that we wanted to do. And yet, one of the things that I have found striking is that you can go through and they really, 70–80%, appreciate the investments in infrastructure, the clean energy, you can kind of go through them one by one and you get these very high numbers. But what you don't get is a sense that that means that we're doing good on the economy. And so I think one question I actually have for those of us that think about what does that mean is literally what does that mean? And I'm starting to wonder if my word, the economy, isn't what most people think. And, is that a function of the trickle down narrative, right? That the economy is what's happening to the business down the street rather than the economy. And when you say it kind of it is a very difficult concept. It's an abstract concept that describes humans exchanging things for, a standard of living, right? It is a very kind of vague notion. And I think many of us would put education and infrastructure and all of these things, I think of as front and center to the economy. Well, if people aren't saying, if that's not what they think of, well, okay, that's fine. We can call things different things, but I'm really heartened by the fact that the actual investments that we're making and the way that we're making them, right? This is a moment where, workers say, hey, I'd really like to be a member of a union. Well, okay, you don't have to call that an economic issue. I mean, it is an economic issue, I think, but that's sort of saying what kind of experience they want to have, how they feel about their participation in this system. I would focus on some of those questions as one tactic. But I think the other thing is that because our economy is in this moment where we're facing new competition from abroad, an altered and perhaps continuing to be altered geopolitical climate. We sat down earlier today, one of the Seattle Times today is about climate, essentially is a climate, I actually can't remember what the headline was, but it was something about climate change. We're seeing these stories every single day. There's a lot of anxiety behind all of that. This is scary. And it's scary both in terms of what these changes that are coming down the pipeline that we can't control are, climate change, and then what we need to do to be able to get that under control. Both of those bring up really deep sets of questions. And so I think the challenge to educational institutions is how are you communicating that, talking about it, creating space to get to that place where it's like, there are solutions. There is hope, right? There are real things. And I think this administration is showing, hey, there are all these things we can do. And we're trying to bring you along, but that requires trust. And I think one thing I learned working on the 2016 campaign is that there's not a lot of trust out there right now. And so how you build that in, I'm so proud of the work that my colleagues have done around the administration in clean energy communities, where that was about building trust. Like we need to do things differently for this health and well-being of us all. We are not abandoning them. So I think those are some of the conversations. So I think that this work, and we didn't, I think, talk enough about inclusion as maybe we wanted to, but it undergirds this entire project. How are we helping people understand that they are a part of this solution and that they are a part of our theory of what's going to be good for the economy, part of what they think the economy is?
Well, for our virtual guests, we're going to conclude this part. But for those of you in person, I would invite you to come up to have some informal conversations with Heather, and just thank her again for taking the time to join us.